Good morning, everyone, and happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And as promised, I want to get right into this. You know, this study that I'm sharing with you this morning that I touched on yesterday morning, listen, a person could write a book, literally, on the word Kairos. It is a word that is so rich and full. As Robert Trench, I believe it's Robert, Trench in his book on the synonyms of the New Testament, Trench pointed out that the normal word for linear time, just time broadly considered, nothing special about it, that's chronos. But Trench pointed out in his book that the word kairos is another word that is totally distinctive and significant. While there are exceptions to the rule, normally kairos designates an appointed special time, a divinely appointed time. And boy, that's important. Because, as I shared with you yesterday, after having spent several weeks developing Isaiah chapter 60 and its promise of the kingdom of God, of the shining of the great light for salvation, the calling of the Gentiles, the creation of a new priesthood, the coming of the new Jerusalem, etc., etc., etc. The Lord said, Isaiah 60, verse 22, I, the Lord, will hasten it, and in the Septuagint, it is, I will gather them in their time. Uses kairos. So, Isaiah 60 is about the time of the salvation of Israel. That's the time of the wedding, folks. Don't lose sight of that. Because the restoration of Zion is always the wedding. It's the remarriage. It's Revelation 19 through 22. Okay, I shared with you yesterday how the Lord said, from the Hebrew, in its time, I will hasten it. When the time for the fulfillment of Isaiah 60 would arrive, the Lord said He would hasten that fulfillment. Now look, we are told constantly by futurists, well, yes, you know, we have all of these time statements in the New Testament. Doug Wilkinson has written a great book. I offer it on my website. On the time statements of the New Testament. The coming of the Lord is at hand is the name of the book. Doug adduces over 300 time statements in the New Testament about the end of the age, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, etc., etc. And yet we're supposed to believe that not one of those time statements had any objective temporal significance to it. Not one of them. That argument completely and totally destroys language and calls God's ability to communicate into serious question. Now watch this. Jesus said in Mark chapter 1 and verse 15, the time, Kairos, is fulfilled. That means, as F.F. Bruce said in one of his books, that a divinely appointed time, which had once been far off, has now, through the process of time, has arrived, and the time for fulfillment has arrived. Well, that's basically what Isaiah 60:22 is teaching. These things were not near in Isaiah's day. They were for the last days. But the Lord promised, just as He said in Joel chapter 3, in those days, that's the last days, and at that time, the day of the Lord will be at hand. Joel wasn't living in the last days, but he said in the last days, the day of the Lord would be near. Joel 3, 1 through 15. So, notice now, in addition to Jesus' statement about the time is fulfilled, And now I've got my Englishman's Greek Concordance because you see there are 82 occurrences of the Greek word Kairos to be found in the New Testament. And I want to pick out just a few of these passages that use the word Kairos to mean an appointed, designated time. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus castigated the Jews. And by the way, he did the same thing in Matthew chapter 16. But he said, how is it that you're able to look at the sky and to be able to discern the weather, but you do not know how to discern the time? That's the time in which they were living. Jesus was saying they should have been able to look around and to see the signs to realize they were living in the predicted time. We go to Acts chapter 3. And we come down, let me see here, let me just run through this. No, let me skip to Romans because there's so many passages that are there. In Romans 3:23 and following, the Lord speaks of how all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but how God in His forbearance passed over those sins to look forward to the time of Christ, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood. And He says, to declare at this time that God is just and the justifier of those who believe. And then in chapter 5 and verse 6, he says, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. Well, wait a minute. At just the right, at the divinely appointed time. Well, what time was that? What was the divinely appointed time for the death of Jesus, the Messiah? Well, Daniel 9 tells us 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your city to seal vision and prophecy, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to make the atonement. Well, what does the atonement involve? Oh, the sacrifice. And to bring in everlasting righteousness. I think I said that. Anyway, now verse 26. In the midst of the week, which is after the 69th week, which means it's in the middle of the 70th week, Messiah shall be cut off. So here is Paul in Romans telling us, Romans chapter 5, in due time, at just the right, at the divinely appointed time, Christ died for the ungodly. And Daniel told us that in the midst of the 70th week, the Messiah would be cut off. So the divinely appointed time was the 70th week of Daniel. Paul said Christ died at the divinely appointed time. And he continues. In Romans 8:18, Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time, the language there is very emphatic, it's very strong, very powerful. And Paul was talking about the sufferings that he and the first century church were enduring, what he calls the sufferings of Christ, Romans 8:16 and 17. And he said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed. You see, the time of the end and the sufferings of the Messiah were taking place at the appointed time, just as the Old Testament had said. And then Paul says in Romans 13:11, and now, knowing the time. Wait a minute. I didn't think anybody's supposed to know the time. Well, Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, the Thessalonians knew what time it was. You know the times and the seasons. And now here's Paul in Romans 13:11 says, knowing the time. But he didn't just say knowing the time. He said the night is far spent. Now wait a minute. What is that night? It is the darkness into which the light of Isaiah promised in Isaiah 60 would shine, bringing salvation. And Paul says the night is far spent. The day, the shining of the true light, the full light has drawn near. Just as John said in 1 John chapter 2, 5 and following, and now, brethren, you know that the darkness is already passing away, and the true light is already shining. But the day, you see, he's using this imagery of the daybreak. The light just beginning to shine, but it was about to break forth. Look, we've got more examples of this because I've got to get to the use of Kairos in Revelation. Because remember, Isaiah 60 foretold what was going to take place in Revelation, which was the wedding of Matthew 25. So what does Revelation have to do about this Kairos, the divinely appointed time? Oh, it has a lot to say about Kairos. We'll get to that on the flip side.